Hi everyone, Stepan here. In today's video we are going to have a detailed look at the Torre Attack, a very interesting system opening for white with which white aims for a quick kingside attack, a quick piece development, and also avoiding some of the main theoretical lines that cause white a lot of problems. Okay, so the Torre Attack is a setup in which white plays d4, knight f3 and bishop g5. That's the first thing you should know. In theory, it can be played against anything, but as we're going to see in chapters I'm going to cover later on in the video, it's not efficient if black plays d5 very early on. It's not efficient if black plays the King's Indian setup or the Gruenfeld setup. So the mainline Torre and what we're going to be calling the Torre Attack is what happens in positions where black plays with e6 and knight f6. Everything else will be inferior, and you have to remember that against everything else, white basically cannot get an advantage. That's the first disclaimer I need to put out there, because the London, for example, can be played against anything, and it's not as if you can get a big advantage with the London against every variation, but in most cases there is something to play for. As we're going to see, that's not the case with the Torre. It's different, and there are some lines in which white can actually end up slightly worse. So what's the point of the opening? Well, after d4 knight f6, knight f3 as our starting move is a very flexible move. The first thing we have to notice is that by playing knight f3 instead of c4, we are avoiding three mainline openings, everything that has to do with bishop b4 check. So we are avoiding the Bogo Indian, we are avoiding the Nimzo Indian, and we're also avoiding the mainline Queen's Indian defense. So that's a very important thing we have to know. Also, if black starts out with pawn to d5, for example, and we go knight f3, we have prevented the Albin counter gambit. So those are some very important openings that we are preventing. However, after knight f3, there are more upsides to this. By playing c4 in the main lines, white is basically not developing. White is preventing d5. That much is true. However, white is not developing his kingside and not developing the pieces as quickly as white does in the Torre Attack. So knight f3 is a very flexible move that gives white many options. It leads to different types of positions if black deviates on move 2, but that's a different story. I'm going to show that in a second. Okay, now after e6, what does the move bishop g5 do? Well, bishop g5 is a multi-purpose move. Most importantly, bishop g5 fights for the control over the e4 square. It also pins the knight, basically neutralizing the knight for a moment. And our setup is enabled by the move bishop to g5. What white wants to do, and I'm going to show this in detail a bit later on, white would like to play pawn to e3, bishop to d3, and knight b to d2. With those three moves, you can see that there's immediate pressure on black's king side. White doesn't have to castle after that. We're going to have a look at several options. But white is basically prepared to get all of his pieces out there close to the black king without wasting time on moves that further control the center and prevent pawn moves like pawn to d5. Okay, now before we get into the actual Torre, and again, this is the Torre main line, I'm going to show you when playing the Torre isn't possible. That's going to be very important because when you take on a system opening like the London system or the Torre Attack, then you have to have a full repertoire. Unfortunately, as I mentioned previously, with the Torre, that's not possible. After d4, there are many ways for black to avoid our system. The first two main moves we have to look at are 1 c5, which will inevitably enter either the Benoni defense or an inferior setup for white, where you either play e3 and you cannot play the Torre attack, or you play c3, which is a concession. And this is what I liked to play when I played the London, because it would still allow me an inferior version of the London, but basically by playing anything other than d5, white isn't playing for an advantage. The same can be said about pawn to f5, where we're basically in the Dutch defense after knight f3, knight f6. If you now play bishop g5, this is the mainline Dutch, classical Dutch, and you're not playing the Torre anymore. Okay. Another thing that we have to say is that the same transpositions are possible if black plays e6 and move 1. Of course, there are many transpositions which are possible, but if we try to play the Torre with knight f3, black doesn't have to play knight f6. Black can play f5, going into the Dutch. Black can play c5, which will now either after d5 lead to a weird Benoni type of position, which isn't good, or after e4 it will lead to an open Sicilian. After pawn takes, knight takes, this both sides have to be ready for. Or after c5, c4, we get a variation of the English opening, basically, which isn't the Torre. And if we play e3, supporting our center, no Torre, the bishop cannot get out to g5. If we play c3, again, this is what I would play when I was playing the London against this early e6, c5. But there are possibilities for black to play queen b6 at some point if you develop your bishop, so it's not... This gives you the best chances of reaching the Torre if black, for example, plays knight f6, but it's not guaranteed. One more thing we have to look at is, well, what if black plays d5? Now, after knight f3, it's possible to enter several different openings. Black can play c5, which is the so-called Krause variation, and again, the Torre isn't possible from here on. Black could play the Chigorin, of course, with knight c6, or black could simply play the move bishop f5, which is the reverse London, and there is no way to punish this, because in the normal London system you start out with bishop f4, and there are ways to fight against this. If you start out with knight f3, this is simply equal for black. And finally, if you try to get the Torre via the normal move order, like if black plays knight f6 and you go bishop g5, there's a variation that's extremely annoying, knight e4, and now again you're not playing the normal Torre. Technically, this is the gossip variation of the Torre attack, but the plans are completely different, very similar to the Trompovsky, and it's not your usual Torre system. That being said, we're going to have a look at the gossip variation in detail in chapter 10. So if you would like to look at that immediately, the video is divided into chapters, so you can easily navigate to that point. Now, let's have a look at the Torre structures. So we said that this is our Torre position, and there are going to be two possible structures from here, which we absolutely have to know. The first structure is going to be the structure where black doesn't play d5 at any point, but instead plays with d6. And the second structure is going to be the structure where black has played pawn to d5. They are very different, so the structure with d5 and without d5. Now I'm going to try to give you the strategic plans for both sides in both structures. Not playing d5 is better for black, and that will lead to the main lines of the Torre, and this, I think, is the best way for black to fight the Torre attack, because it keeps the structure fluid and the piece placement is easy. Most importantly, by not putting the pawn on d5, black isn't relinquishing control over the e5 square, which, as we're going to see, is the usual launch pad for white's attack. White would eventually like to play knight e5, as is the case in the London system, and then black being able to control e5 with d6 is a big deal. Now, a couple of moves which you can play instantly are knight b to d2, bishop to d3, pawn to c3, supporting your center, and castles kingside. those are moves that are always a part of your Torre setup. So you don't have to think about move orders that much. These moves are basically mandatory if you're going to be playing this system. Okay, now let's talk about plans. Okay, after we've completed the beginning of our setup, so bishop d3, knight d2, c3 castles, playing rook e1, rook from f to e1, is usually much better in positions without d5, because we would eventually like to use the semi-open e file. What black can usually do is exchange on d4, clarifying the situation in the center, at which point our rook is useful on the e file. If black does not exchange, having a rook on e1 is also useful for trying to push through e4 and then eventual e5. When there's a pawn on d6, usually that structure can be safely undermined. Okay, one thing you have to watch out for is the actual e4 pawn break. That's also a plan we have to consider. If you ever play e4, it's possible for black to gain a ton of queenside control by exchanging, forcing you to take with the c pawn and gaining control over the b4 square. Okay, that's something you have to be mindful of. One plan for black, which we have to consider, is positions where black eventually plays the move knight d5. Okay, sorry, let's not play here, let's play okay, where black eventually plays knight d5 or knight h5, and these two moves aim to exchange pieces. Of course, with white's bishop being so annoying on g5, one normal way of dealing with that would be to, well, exchange pieces. So knight d5 accomplishes that. We have a pawn on c3 or on c2, so that's always going to be possible. Knight h5 serves the same purpose. Now, one key square other than e5, which is less important when the pawn is still left on d7 or developed to d6, is the e4 square. So in many positions, after, for example, knight to d2 and bishop e7, white could go for the plan of exchanging on f6, thus gaining control over the e4 square, which may or may not be useful, but you have to be aware of it. Okay, so those are the typical plans for white in this structure without d5. For black, what black is going to try to do, black is going to try to play positions with b6 and d6 with the bishop on b7, or in some cases the bishop on a6, trying to neutralize white's very strong bishop on d3. And even though it isn't that easy to launch an attack if there's a pawn on d6, so you don't have usual London and Torre ideas of knight e5 and then getting the queen towards the king's side, exchanging the bishop on d3 is often a good idea, because strategically, when white has pawns on dark squares, this is white's powerful bishop, and even though the bishop on g5 is technically a good piece, performing a very strong role, pinning the knight, it's on the same color as white's pawn chain, therefore it's white's bad bishop. So exchanging that is often useful. So what black usually does is b6, bishop b7, bishop e7, d6, keeping full control. Then eventually black is going to try to clarify things in the center by exchanging on d4. Now again, our rook belongs on the semi-open file if that happens. And our queen, now this part is kind of debatable. One good plan is to get the queen either to c2 or to b1 to increase pressure on h7, pinning this knight, which can always be answered with something like h6. And the other idea is to try and put pressure on black's queen side with a move like queen a4. That's also possible, since there is a pawn on b6 in most cases. There could be plans of undermining the queen side with a3 and b4 later on, and trying to attack the c pawn. Okay, now the structure with the pawn on d5 is way simpler. one thing I forgot to say, if you would like to get the PGN for this entire video, it's available on my Patreon feed, as are most opening PGNs. It may make it easier for you to navigate through the video. Okay, with the pawn on d5, the situation is completely different. Now, I'm not saying this is bad for black, in a sense that black is losing by force, but black is going to come under tremendous pressure in these variations, and the reason is simple. If you would like to unpin your knight, which is necessary in the Torre as opposed to the London, I'm going to keep using the London as a reference point because the only difference is that the bishop is on f4. So if you want to unpin your knight, you have to play bishop e7 at some point, and bishop e7 is going to be usually how black develops. However, if you do that, you have absolutely no control over e5. And of course, if you play something like knight c6 as black and white plays knight e5, that's going to lead to this knight leaving the defense of h7, allowing white's bishop on d3 to become much stronger. And also, since the knight is on e5, maybe the queen could come over via h5 or via f3, h3. So it's going to be very hard for black to challenge the e5 square when the pawn has advanced. That's the first thing we have to notice. So again, your normal developing moves are bishop d3, knight d2, and c3. When the pawn is on d5, I would advise against kingside castling quickly, because you may want to leave your king in the center, or actually castle queenside in some positions, and also because you may want to push your h-pawn and leave the rook on h1. I'm going to show you some variations in chapter 7 where that's actually very useful. Okay, so again, for white, knight e5 is the usual starting point for an attack. For black, black should really develop the knight to d7 instead of c6, and there are two reasons for that. Well, firstly, it's supporting the knight on f6 and the e5 square, which is important, but also after b6, bishop b7, the bishop isn't blocked in, so it lends further support to d5, and that could be useful. So black's setup in these positions is usually going to be a kind of Queen's Indian with c5, d5, with bishops on e7, b7, pawn on b6, knight on d7, and castles. And what white should do is start an attack. So those are the two structures we're going to be looking at when considering the Torre. And those plans are going to be what we have to know. Now let's start looking at the actual theory. So after pawn to d4, let's get into the main line. Knight f6, knight f3, e6, bishop to g5. Now black's main line and black's best idea is to challenge the center straight away with pawn to c5. We defend with e3, and we have our setup. Black plays bishop to e7, unpinning. And now we need to be slightly careful about different ideas like knight e4, so we should start with knight b to d2. b6, as we said, this is black's standard reply, and you could call this the reti in reverse for black, but without g3. Instead of playing d6, g6, bishop g7, black is playing the setup with c5, b6, e6, bishop e7. So in my opinion, this resembles the Queen's Indian defense more than anything else. Now, this is playable against the London as well, and the usual plans in the London involve c3 and the quick undermining of the queen side, which is met with a6, preventing a further advance, and then white usually plays the move queen b3 and continuous pressure on the queen side. The same plans can apply here and can be played here, so keep that in mind. Okay, bishop d3, white continues, bishop to b7, c3. And what black usually does, although black doesn't have to do it, is black clarifies the situation in the center very early on. Because how you recapture is going to give black a ton of information. It's possible, of course, for black to play knight c6 or castles. So, for example, knight c6. Castles, castles, a3, trying to play b4 at some point, and also making sure that on cd, you're preventing knight b4. So c takes d, knight d5, going for the quick piece exchanges. These are all very standard plans. Now, personally, I don't think white has an advantage here at all. The engine says plus 0.3, so slight advantage to white, but you have to be creative with moves like h4. As you can see, bishop e7 of course leads to equality. h4 is an engine idea which tries to keep space and tries to advance on the king side, but of course it's not as useful after castling. But the main idea for black is to exchange immediately. And now if you go c takes and knight c6, you're basically forced to play the move a3 and transpose to the line we just looked at. So I would advise you to actually take with the e pawn. Now this may sound slightly strange, giving black an extra central pawn, but what we get in exchange is pressure down the e file. So after d6, preventing any sort of knight e5 ideas and so on, castles, knight b to d7, rook e1 and castles, you can see that black is playing the hedgehog basically against, well, a normal position for white where all of the pieces have been developed. You could also say that black has ideas of undermining with the minority attack, but that's not possible in the same way it's possible in other simpler positions, because all of white's pieces are tremendously active. So after something like a4, trying to put pressure on the queen side, and a6, white has several different options. One plan which I would like to mention, which I like playing, and it isn't as popular, is simply playing queen e2. By playing queen e2, you're, well, preventing rook c8 for the moment. You're preventing both b5 and a5. a5 would give away the b5 square, b5 would lose a pawn, rook c8 would lose a pawn. So queen e2 is a very flexible move. However, it does restrict the scope of your rook. Okay, so your rook isn't as useful. Another plan you could go for is playing knight f1, transferring the knight to the king side, and trying to increase your control over the e4 square. So knight f1, knight g3, and then knight f to d2. But that would lead to mass exchanges, and depending on what you would like to do, it may not be a good idea, it may lead to a draw. One of the main plans, though, is to go knight c4, trying to put pressure on these two weak pawns, b6 and d6, and then further increasing the pressure after something like rook e8, continuing bishop to f4. Now we're basically in the London system, and we come to a point at which it's clear why the Torre system isn't the main line. If black knows what he's doing, it's very hard to continue putting pressure in this position. After something like queen c7, what are your options? I mean, you can play rook c1, you can play h3, you can play several different waiting moves, but you don't really have anything major. It's also possible to transfer the knight to e3 later on and sort of relieve the pressure on d6, but there isn't that many ideas to make progress, which is why I prefer, instead of knight c4, to play this idea with queen e2. And against queen e2 and something like rook e8, plans with knight c4 are still possible, knight f1 too, but if you play a waiting move like h3 and black plays knight f8, then let's fight for e4. I mean, if this knight moves away, there's the idea to take and go bishop e4 or knight e4. If mass exchanges happen, and by mass exchanges I mean we manage to trade off these two bishops somehow, maybe I'm going to be able to put more pressure on the queen side later on if I manage to fix the pawn structure. Again, it's nothing major, and of course the position is almost completely equal, but these are just some ideas against the main line. You cannot expect to get a huge advantage if you play a sideline opening and your opponent knows the best way to punish it. So against the main line, there really isn't much white can do to play for an advantage. You're going to lead, you're going to steer the game into an equal evaluation, basically, and then you have to come up with some creative ideas. Okay, now the next variation we have to look at is the so-called Torre poisoned pawn, and this is the critical line you absolutely have to know if you're going to play the Torre. So in the main line after e3, instead of playing bishop e7, continuing with the main line, black plays the move queen b6. And this is very similar to what happens in the London system after d4, knight f6, bishop f4, c5, e3, queen b6. This is basically the same position. Knight f3 was inserted in the Torre attack, but there's a big difference here. In the London, white's main move is knight c3. And the reason for that is very, very simple. By playing knight c3, white is discouraging black from taking on b2, and the reason for that is simple. We have pressure on c7. So if queen b2 is played, white's main move is of course knight b5, and now black needs to take care of this square. The theory goes on. I don't want to get into the London system, but the same position in the Torre attack is very much different, simply because this bishop isn't controlling the c7 square, so we cannot react the same way. If we play knight c3 here, for example, and we have no control over c7, black can just continue d5. If black continues queen takes b2, then knight b5, then of course black has queen b4 check, knight to d2, for example, and queen a5. And black is successfully controlling the c7 square. Of course, if bishop f4 now, then knight a6. So we cannot do the same thing. The poisoned pawn is a way for black to try and punish white for playing the Torre, but I'm going to show you a way to keep your advantage here, and well, I'm going to actually give you a choice. You can give the pawn up and play for dynamic compensation, or you can defend the pawn and play for strategic superiority. One thing I should mention is that b3 is definitely not a good move. The same thing can be said about the London. Never defend your b-pawn with b3 or b6. It just leaves too many weaknesses, and temporarily it solves your issues, but it doesn't do anything for your position. It's harmful long term. So we're going to have a look at two good moves which are very different. One of them is knight b to d2, giving the pawn up. The other one is queen c1. Let's look at queen c1 because it's not the critical move, but it's actually the move I prefer. Now, queen c1 may seem passive because it gets the queen away from the center. However, there is a huge strategic upside to queen c1. In order to understand it, we need to understand the move queen b6. So when black played queen b6, black was putting pressure on b2. Long term though, where is this bishop going? Queen b6 prevents b6, so in order to develop the bishop, black either has to play d5, bishop d7, or d6, bishop d7, both of which are inferior to having a bishop on b7, or black has to bring the queen all the way back, for example, to d8, because if you play queen c7, I have bishop f4 maybe, and then you have to play b6. So by defending with queen c1, you're basically saying that your queen can easily be activated or reactivated, whereas this bishop is going to suffer long term because of queen b6. Arguably, this queen is more active than this one, but if you don't develop your bishop, you're going to be worse. So queen c1 is a very sensible move. Black has a couple of options. If knight e4, which may seem like the most logical move, then bishop f4, excuse me, and everything is safe. Knight c6, c3, safe position, d5, knight b to d2. Now, in this case, black can enter a position in which they have huge control over the e4 square, so of course don't exchange the knights. So black could opt to play f5, but black could also just take, queen takes, bishop e7, bishop d3, bishop to d7, castles. This is obviously more pleasant for white than it is for black. This is simply an improved London system where white has no disadvantages. The bishop on d7 is a bad piece. So if black does go for knight e4, black should go with f5 and at least keep control over the e4 square. Alternatively, of course, black doesn't have to play knight e4. Black can just continue developing and say, okay, you can take my knight, I don't care, I have pressure on d4 and the bishop pair, so don't take the knight, just go c3. And again, if d5, same position, knight b to d2, bishop to d7, bishop to d3, something like rook c8, maybe queen b1, trying to put pressure on h7 and also getting away from this pin. So again, a pleasant position where you have a better bishop. It's nothing major, but we're punishing queen b6 by keeping this bishop passive. Okay, so that's one response. And it's actually the response I prefer because, as you probably know, I'm not a big fan of crazy tactical positions. But if you are, attacking prospects after knight b to d2 are huge. Now here's the idea. Of course, black doesn't have to take the pawn. Black has a very common response to knight b d2, and that's d5. To be perfectly honest, I don't see what the point of queen b6 was if you're not going to take the pawn. Also, d5 just allows me to take on f6 and then continue with c4. You can defend the pawn with rook b1, but c4 I think is more promising. Something like cd4, ed4, knight c6, cd5, ed5, bishop d3. I mean, how can white be anything but slightly better in this position? You're a pawn down, but that's completely irrelevant. Black's pawn structure is ruined. Black's king is unsafe. You're going to play rook e1, many attacking ideas. So if white goes knight b d2, black really should take the pawn and at least have something. Now, the main move here is bishop d3, but there are some positions which I don't like after bishop d3. So I'm going to recommend that you go bishop f6 straight away. In most positions after bishop d3, you're going to transpose to bishop takes f6 anyway. But we're going to be taking on f6 immediately because we're going to try to exploit the weakness on f6 straight away. Now we continue bishop d3. One thing I would like to mention is, even though that's a line and it's possible, knight e4 straight away is a bad move. Okay, so putting pressure on c5 and on f6. If, for example, c takes d4, which is black's best move, knight f6 may seem like a good position for white, but after king e7, knight e4, this position isn't good. The engine gives this as completely losing for white, more than -2 for black. Of course, that's not true in practice because the black king is unsafe, but still, don't risk your opponent being heavily prepared in this line and just don't play knight e4. There's no need for that. I'm going to show you how to compensate for the pawn without playing crazy moves. Okay, so bishop d3 first. Now, black has options. Black could take on d4. Against pawn d4, I like knight takes d4 because it gives us more options and also we're not isolating our pawn. I know that you haven't opened up the e-file, but the knight can be extremely useful in light of an eventual e5, and you're immediately looking at the f5 square, which again can be done if you take with the pawn and then go knight h4, knight f5 if e5 is played, but I prefer taking with the knight. Other options for black are queen b6, for example, trying to get the queen out of harm's way. You castle, you don't care about the open g file. Black isn't in time to use it. For example, if black makes a mistake here, like bishop e7, then you can punish queen b6 straight away with d5. And this really isn't easy for black to defend. You have knight c4, d6 coming up. So black probably should take, and now knight h4. The idea behind d5 in all of these positions is simply weakening the f5 square. So this, I think, is a huge advantage to white. The engine doesn't say winning, but it says white is better. So queen b6 not really advisable. If a normal move like knight c6 is played, then again you just castle, and again bishop e7 runs into d5, so it shouldn't really be played. Let's clarify the situation in the center. If the queen is still on b2 in these positions, I think inserting rook b1 is useful, just getting the queen from the defense of d4. So queen takes a2 and now ed4. And again, if black isn't careful, you're going to play d5 at some point, maybe prefaced with bishop to c4. So black should play d5. And this is sort of safe. But now comes the point at which we not really seek compensation, but we keep the initiative going. If you play a passive move, then black could be in time to reach a position similar to many Sicilians or French defense positions where there is no g7 pawn. In this case it's on f6, but it's not really relevant. So you have to keep the initiative going. So play the move c4. And against this, well, what are black's options? I mean, you're going to open up the e file. If this is taken, that's just too scary. I mean, this bishop is looking at e6. We can play rook e1 and aim to put our knight into f5. Black's pieces are undeveloped, d5 is hanging. So really, I mean, this is going to happen. For example, bishop d7 takes. It's going to happen. So if you don't see compensation for the pawn here, play queen c1 instead. Personally, I see the compensation, but I still play queen c1 because I prefer slow positions in which I'm strategically better. But if I had to win, I would be very happy here. Okay, so that's the poison pawn variation. So remember that black doesn't have to play bishop e7, black could play queen b6. Now, let's look at the structure where black actually plays d5. And this is going to be the most fun of all the variations we look at, because this is what the Torre player would like to achieve. So bishop g5, bishop e7. So black plays without c5 and instead plays the move d5. Now this is fun for white. Okay, let's continue our setup. So bishop e3, bishop d3, c3, all very standard. Black tries to go for the sort of Queen's Indian type of setup with the fianchetto bishop, or bishop a6, and now we start the attack. Knight e5. Now, in this position, playing bishop a6 isn't good, which is why we have to play knight e5 straight away. Of course, this runs into bishop a6, knight c6, forking queen and bishop and keeping this pin, and it's going to be followed with queen to f3, for example. Bishop a6 takes, knight takes, knight c6, queen d7, takes, queen f3 is the simplest way to play for an advantage. Just go for a structural advantage and eventually you're going to be better. So knight e5, bishop b7. And here you have a couple of options. Now, people play f4 here, and it may seem like the simplest attacking move, trying to castle and then go for queen f3, queen h3, or rook f3, rook h3. But there is a downside to this. If you play f4 too early, then knight e4 is a good response for black. And I would advise you not to do this, because knight e4 is very, very close to equality, unless you play something like h4, which gets crazy, giving up the g3 square, and you're forced to exchange pieces and so on. One alternative is h4, which is a perfectly playable move, trying to force your pawn down the board and keeping control over e4, or potential control with f3, and you could continue with f3, g4. But again, I don't think it's the best plan. Here's the best plan, which is almost irresistible in these positions. Now again, they aren't losing by force. The engine is always going to say that it's about equal, but black is going to have to play a series of only moves. So if you're playing someone below grandmaster level, this position is going to be very hard to navigate for them. We start by playing queen to f3. And our idea is extremely simple. We want to go queen h3, bishop f6, queen h7, checkmate. Okay? Black develops, knight b to d7. Queen h3, mate threat on the board. Simple. They go h6, defending h7 and trying to chase our bishop away. But now we don't move our bishop away. We play knight d to f3. And if black takes the bishop, it's game over. The engine here says equal, it says 0.2 for white. Okay, let's look at what happens if black takes the bishop. If black takes the bishop, knight takes g5 is +8. +8. Why is it +8? Well, if black plays nothing, it's mate in 2 or 3. For example, rook b8, mate in 3, bishop h3 here, and now knight f7. That's mate, so rook takes, knight takes. If on knight g5, well, the best move according to the engine is queen e8, but let's look at g6. We simply go queen h6, and after, for example, queen e8, we start sacrificing things over here. Now black is forced to give up the queen. If queen e8 immediately, then we go into the same variation where this cannot be taken, and knight f7, and of course black is going to have to give up the queen and the rook, and it's going to be just deadly. So the bishop cannot be taken. So what should black do? Now this position has never been reached, so there isn't really any theory here, but what black needs to do is black needs to try and exchange pieces. Remember how black played knight d5 or h5 in those different types of positions with the pawn on d6 or d7? Well, in this case, since the pawn is on d5, black has knight e4, and knight e4 is going to trade pieces off. If this is taken, of course, black would even be better, because with a pawn on e4 supported by the bishop, the d5 square for the knight eventually, the position is huge. So you really are forced to exchange on e7 now. And I'm not saying black should play f6 at any point later, but if something like this happens, then obviously your advantage is, your attacking potential is gone. And if black is careful, you're going to have a position with a bit more space. Maybe strategically you could still be better with proper exchanges on e4, but it's going to be nothing major. However, remember this plan of queen f3. It's going to be very, very hard for black to navigate. For example, as we said, knight b7, queen h3, h6. h6 seems like the most natural reply. I don't even know what else to do. g6 seems very bad because you give up all the dark squares. Exchanging on e5 doesn't seem good to me because the knight is forced away into e4. Knight e4 immediately seems good without h6, but white should be better in that position slightly. So that's what happens if black plays with d5. I think, again, those positions are very easy to play. Now, let's look at the Torre versus the King's Indian defense. The reason I'm starting from this position and not from the beginning is because this is the position you're going to get. And I have to emphasize this. White doesn't have an advantage here. It's going to be very similar to what happens when white tries to play the London against the King's Indian. Black is fine. White doesn't have the space advantage. White doesn't have the improved piece activity. White doesn't have targets. That being said, black doesn't have a kingside attack, so because it's not the proper King's Indian, but it's very hard for white to play for the advantage here. Okay, so d4, knight f6, knight f3, g6. Black is trying to play the King's Indian, and we go bishop to g5. Now, this technically is called the Torre attack, and this is supposed to be the fianchetto defense, but thinking in terms of variation names is wrong. The way you have to be thinking about these positions is, okay, my opponent either plays the King's Indian or the Gruenfeld. So if the pawn ends up on d6, it's going to be a King's Indian. If the pawn ends up on d5, it's going to be a Gruenfeld. If black plays b6, it's going to be a weird hippotype system. Black can play several different things. Let's look at the King's Indian first. Okay, so bishop g7, and let's complete our setup. Knight bd2, castles, c3, d6, And in this case, if you try to play with the pawn on e3, you're not trying to play for the advantage at all. So I would advise you not to play the move e3. This is going to lead to London types of positions after the eventual bishop f4, or even with the bishop on g5, where your only source of play is going to be on the queen side. Of course, black should continue c5, and you play something like bishop e2, black goes b6, castles, bishop to b7, a4, a6. This has been played a million times with the bishop on f4, and arguably this is even slightly worse than having a bishop on f4, because you don't have control over the c7 square, allowing the queen easier development in most cases and allowing the rook to come to d8. Also, black doesn't have to play for c5. Black could also play for e5 with something like rook e8, knight bd7, or rook e8, knight c6. So playing e3 really gives black no problems at all. The only way to play the Torre against the King's Indian and to try and play for the advantage is to go e4. And I'm sorry, but you just have to get out of your comfort zone. You're going to be seeing the King's Indian a lot, and this is the only way to play. Black should counter that with c5, and white's best, because white doesn't want to lose all the central control, is to actually take. D takes, and we reach the key position in Torre versus King's Indian games, and it's this position here. And there are two general rules. If white can keep control over the c4 square and keep a minor piece on c4 without it being dislodged, preferably the knight, but the bishop is good too, or if white can favorably advance with e5 without any huge issues or the pawn being hanging, then usually white is better. So what white should do is just continue developing, let's say knight c6, let's say castles, and black needs to bear those two ideas in mind. So there is one idea that seems well, good to me, which black can play instead of knight c6, but it can be played with knight c6 too, and it's to get the rook to d8 quickly. That seems to prevent white's play in most cases. So queen c7 quickly, also preventing e5, rook e1, trying to play e5, and now h6 can be inserted, but it doesn't have to be inserted. Black can play rook d8 straight away, but let's say h6, bishop h4, knight h5 is a good idea, opening up the bishop, preventing e5, and for example queen c2, rook d8. To me, this is equal, so this is one of the best plans for black. If I were black, I would do this. Remember not to make any sudden pawn moves as black, just try to activate your pieces, try to activate your bishop, and try to prevent e5. As white, if e5 is allowed, for example, rook d8, queen c2, and then bishop to g3, then white is better. For example, b6, which isn't a good move, bishop to g3. Of course, if e5 is played, then white is immediately better because this bishop is blocked, and white's counterpart is amazing on c4. Also, g6 would be hanging in many cases, but let's say that black plays one more bad move. Let's say queen to d7. We now continue e5, and the game is basically over. The only thing black can do is block on c4, but now we keep piling on pressure. If black doesn't play knight to d5, if black doesn't play knight to d5, but instead plays something weird like knight to h5, then there's immediate pressure, and you can just take. So that's the way to fight for an advantage. You basically have to play with e4. Get out of your comfort zone. Okay, against the Gruenfeld, it's a bit easier, and again, it's similar to what happens in the London system. So we're looking at the same position, but the pawn isn't on d6, it's on d5. And the upside is, of course, you get the e5 square. The downside is you cannot play e4, so What black really should be doing is trying to control e5 as much as possible and trying to put pressure on b2 as quickly as possible. So for example, e3 castles, bishop d3, c5, c3, queen b6. And this immediately forces rook b1. Knight c6 doesn't really prevent knight e5, but it kind of does, because if you go knight e5, then takes, knight d7, e6. But if it's prepared with e6, then knight d7 is actually devastating, and white would have to end up playing f4. So I don't think you should go for knight e5 if there's a knight on c6. Instead, just continue developing castles, rook e8. I like b4 as a plan, and that's what grandmasters usually play in this position, trying to put pressure on the pawn on c5, and black usually takes on b4 and c takes b4. And again, black should be equal. You can see that the pawn structure is symmetrical, except for the fact that white's pawn isn't on g3. So black should just try to undermine it and equalize on the queen side immediately. White has a space advantage. Let's don't give white a space advantage. So for example, takes and queen takes. Equal, with black, of course, having pressure on e2 and white having pressure on b7. That doesn't mean that there are no winning ideas. If the knight ever leaves the defense of e5, knight e5 is strong, maybe bishop b5 is strong, and then knight e5. There are ideas, but the position should be equal. Okay, so once again, this is called the Torre attack, but it doesn't lead to Torre attack positions. So we have to call it that way because I'm trying to give you a full repertoire, but it's not our desired position. Okay, now the gossip variation. If black plays d5 on move 1 or on move 2. Now, personally, if black plays d5, do something else. Don't play bishop g5 on move 3. It's not a good move. It's simply not a good move. I mean, you should really go c4. I mean, against d4, d5, playing bishop g5 just is a bad version of the Trumpovsky, basically. So try to learn some Queen's Gambit lines. I don't see another way to go about having an advantage out of the opening. But okay, if you insist on playing the Torre against everything, bishop g5 can be played. And of course, if black plays something like e6, then we're fine. We're in the same position we just looked at, the Torre with e6 and d5. Unfortunately, black can play the move knight e4, and knight e4 is annoying. You have two options, h4 or f4. You really don't want to give up your bishop. I think both are playable, but bishop f4 should be better. And after bishop f4, this, to me, is a bad version of the London system. You know that I've played the London system a lot. I don't like having the black knight on e4 for no reason at all. It's black to play, I just wasted the tempo. Okay, so c5, e3 you have to defend, and now queen b6. And again, we have to go for queen c1, but look at the difference here. This bishop is open, and black will not have any strategic downside to playing queen b6. And of course, the same variation with knight to d2, giving up the pawn doesn't really work, because there's a knight on e4, so this can be exchanged straight away. There's absolutely no way to put pressure on c7. And if you try knight c3 trying to put pressure on c7, then simply knight takes c3. And I don't like these positions. So this is why I would advise you not to do that. And if you play bishop h4 instead of bishop f4, I think it's even worse. c5 again, e3, queen b6 again, and queen c1 again. What do? I mean, black is just going to go knight c6, you go c3, and then black goes bishop f5, which is the same setup black would go for if your bishop was on f4 and you played queen c1. You have to realize that there is no advantage here for white whatsoever. The engine says minus 0.5. I think in practice it's even worse. So against d4, d5, just don't play the Torre Attack. You can, but point 1, you're not going to get the Torre because of knight e4. Point 2, you're going to be worse. Okay. That's it for the video. I think I covered most important topics. If you have any suggestions or something to add, please comment below. Again, if you want the PGM for this entire opening, it's available on Patreon. Thank you very much for watching. We are continuing with the English tomorrow, or sorry, on Sunday. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.